Hi friend, this is Celeste from Finger Play Studio in Louisville, Colorado, and this is my weekly update for the week of March 21st. It's spring break here for our students, but we are open Monday through Saturday from 12 to 4, and we also have online shopping. I'm starting today with a finished object, and this is my pillow. It's finally finished. It is from a series of pillows called the Cushion Club by Susan Ashcroft, and this is pillow number 1. It's called the Tube. It is a mosaic chart that you follow this way. I made mine a little longer rather than square, and then I thought it would be fun to add an I-cord edging to it, so I did that. And I used Queensland Brisbane. That is this awesome color changing yarn. I used 2 skeins of that along with less than 1 skein of Ultra Wool by Barocco. Now, the pillow pattern I think calls for worsted weight, and I used an Aran weight and a worsted. I wanted a little bit of texture, and I also really like the colors, and I just happen to have some Ultra Wool in my stash from another project that was left over. So that's what I used for that, which is a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk to you about today, and that is yarn substitution. So when I first started knitting sweaters, primarily, a long time ago, I would go to my local yarn shop with a pattern that I found in a magazine, because this was way before Ravelry. And of course, the pattern is always going to point to one particular yarn because patterns are usually written that way for one yarn. And it would never fail that every time I went into this shop and I said, I want to make this, you don't have this yarn, can you help me? And they would say, sorry, we don't have that yarn, no. And that's not how it works, as you probably know. You can substitute yarns. Any yarn shop is not going to have every single yarn that you see on Ravelry or in a magazine or book. So this is not an in-depth look at yarn substitution. We're just going to go over it really quickly, but basically there are 4 or maybe 5 things that you need to consider. And when you look at your pattern, the first thing that you want to look at is the weight of the yarn. So if the pattern is written for worsted weight yarn, you know that you're going to look at worsted weight yarns and start from there. You'll also look at your needle size, because sometimes it's a different needle size for the yarn. So for example, worsted weight yarn is usually knit on 7s or 8s, but maybe it's a hat and they want to take you down to 5s so that it's a tight knit and air doesn't come through. So that's number 1, is weight. The next thing you'll look at is the yardage. Now, most designers will write a pattern using one particular yarn, either because it's a promotion for that yarn or that's just what they decided to use. And so they'll usually give you the total yardage for your size plus the number of balls they used. And often that will be, say they use a yarn that has 220 yards in it and they use 6 balls, so they just say, okay, I used 220 times 6 for the total yardage. But most patterns are never usually written so that they're very, very close. So if, for example, you're looking at a yarn and there are only 1,000 yards available, but the pattern says 1,020, that's probably just because that's how the yardage was on the yarn that they chose. However, you do always want to make sure that you get enough yardage and probably a little extra when you're buying your yarn so that your dye lots match and you don't have that anxious moment where you think you're running out of yarn. So we always encourage you to buy a little extra. And then let's talk about fiber. So I have a couple of examples. To get the look that you want in the pattern, and maybe you're going for exactly the picture. You want that color, you want that kind of look to it. Maybe it's got a sheen, maybe it's really rustic, whatever that is, that's another thing that you need to consider when picking out your yarn. So if, for example, just because I have this handy, if I am looking at a worsted weight and I see, oh, Barocco's coming in the exact color I want, but Barocco is kind of, it just looks like a wool, and maybe the other one, the picture that I see, is bumpy or it's fluffy or something, then this is not going to be giving you the same look that you want. So sometimes you can mix two yarns that maybe are even different weights but are going to give you the same effect. So here I have this sweater, and it was knit with Madeline Tosh. It called for a DK, and so the main part of it was knit with Madeline Tosh DK. And then because I know that Rios, even though it's a worsted weight, and Tosh DK are so close in their thickness, I mixed them. And using the same needles, you really can't tell. It also helps that I was doing color work in the mixing, which sometimes can tighten up. So I'm using a worsted weight, using the same needles, and it works really well. There's no kind of like bump to see a texture change. And then, as I was talking about with texture and look, when I did the Spark cardigan, Andrea Mallory's was probably a bit, not thinner, but not quite as bulky as mine, because I first chose Noro as my color changing yarn, where she uses Spin Cycle, and Spin Cycle is tighter twist to it than Noro Corian, which is just a single ply. And then to complement the single ply in the Noro, I chose Manos Maxima, which is another single ply. So that's a yarn substitution that also worked. Another thing to consider is whether you want your yarn to be superwash or non-superwash, and you can look at the original yarn that was used in your pattern and make that decision as well. But know that superwash yarns tend to have more drape. They also tend to stretch a bit. So if I'm making a cardigan, I'm probably going to use a 100% wool, because a cardigan needs a nice structure. Also, if you're using like alpaca instead of a structured wool, you're also going to get more drape. So you need to consider what the and then there's color. And going back to this sweater was done in, the original pattern was a solid color. And I just thought I wanted to make it a little more modern, a little funky. And so to make it my own, which is another thing you can do with yarn substitution, you can totally get creative. I chose a variegated yarn. So I think that those are like the top things, but do know that you're not alone. When you come into Finger Play and you say, I want to make this thing and it uses this yarn that you don't have. Well, we're a small shop. We can't carry everything, but we are happy to help you find a suitable substitution, and I think in most cases we can. If you get our newsletter, watch your inbox, because later this week I'm going to have a special announcement for you, and that is only for people who get our newsletter. So if you don't get our newsletter, go onto our website at fingerplaystudio.com. Right at the top, there's a box for you to put in your email address. That gets you signed up for the newsletter. It also gets you signed up for our loyalty program, which is when you spend $200 over time, you get a $20 store coupon from us. And you also learn about all the classes and the new yarns, all before anybody else. So watch your newsletter. Have a great week. If it is your spring break, make sure that you have plenty of yarn for all of your projects. I always have way more projects that I know I'm going to knit, and we will see you in the studio or right here. Have fun.